Let's go to these dogs and really break it down. Let's break down the season before we lead in this Alabama game. Just sort of kind of recap from your analysis what has led to this much success for Kirby Smart.
Well, I think one of the things you got to mention off the top there is, and it's nothing anyone could have imagined at the time, one of the pivotal moments ends up being in the first quarter of the first game of the year. Hard to imagine now because of everything that Jake Fromm has been through, but he was not the original beginning of the season starter for Georgia quarterback. It was Jacob Eason. Eason was the former Gatorade Player of the Year at quarterback coming out of high school in the state of Washington. He had an up and down, mostly good, I guess, freshman season. He was the incumbent starter, but he gets hurt. No fault of his own. He just got injured during the game. Fromm came in, played well, then continued to play pretty well while Eason was recovering from his injury. Then by the time that Eason was healthy enough to return to the field, Fromm was playing too well to go to the bench. He handled the stress of being a first-time starter on the road at Notre Dame, led Georgia to some big blowout victories over rivals like Tennessee. And at that point in time, the job was kind of his. And he has progressed and gotten better over the course of the year and really given Georgia an extra compliment to go along with what was already going to be a really good running game. Well, Fromm has kind of developed himself into a pretty good passer. The other thing here, Georgia offensive line in 2016, Kirby Smart's first year, was just flat out not good. This year they were expected to be better, but they've actually probably ended up being much better than most would have assumed. Those are the two big stories for me because I think most people assumed that Georgia was going to be good defensively. They've ended up being exactly like they were supposed to be. But the offensive line better than many would have thought, and Jake Fromm has developed as a freshman more quickly than I think anybody could have imagined.
When you look at Georgia's defense, ranked in the top 10 in most categories when we begin to break it down, was that just a run into a generational player like Baker Mayfield, or did Georgia's defense get exposed?
Well, I think that when you take on an offense like Oklahoma's, when you take on what Mayfield's able to do, I do think that there's a huge challenge associated with that, right? I mean, those spread offenses are designed to get yards, they're designed to compile points, and in the first half that's exactly what happened. But if you look at what happened in the second half, though, entirely different story. Georgia gave up more than 9 yards of play from the Oklahoma offense the first half. That goes down to just a little bit more than 4 yards of play in the second half. Mayfield only has 87 yards passing after the half. So you have two dramatically different performances from the Georgia defense the first half to the second. And I think that's just probably an overall composite story of an Oklahoma offense that's pretty tough to deal with.
What is the injury standpoint for the Dogs right now?
Well, I think if you want to look at, Georgia's injury situation, it's one of the areas in which, the Dogs have been really lucky all season long. They are much, much healthier than Alabama has been. Right now, I guess the only significant injury you might think about for Georgia, Charlie Warner, a tight end who had 3 catches in the game against Oklahoma, did leave the Rose Bowl in a bit of a walking boot. He looks like he got banged up a little bit during the game. But other than that, Georgia is and has been very healthy, the same way that Alabama has dealt with so many injuries to linebackers and so many lost plays and games from significant expected contributors. Georgia, one of the reasons why it's in this game is it just has not had to deal with that kind of stuff this year.
Brandon, when you look at Nick Saban, and you've been covering the league for a long time, you've been covering Georgia for a long time, you see Kirby Smart. How much of Nick Saban do you see in Kirby Smart in that system there in Athens?
I think one of the reasons why Kirby Smart probably looks more like Nick Saban to a lot of folks is because Jim McElwain goes to Florida. He's a former Saban assistant, but he doesn't bring players with him. McElwain outside the top 20 in recruiting for 2015, outside the top 10 in both 2016 and 2017. You can't replicate Nick Saban's success if you're not in at least the top 5 in recruiting, if not, as Saban has done, the number 1 overall class. Same thing for, Will Muschamp obviously has the great recruiting success at Florida, but has a hard time finding the quarterback, has a hard time selling on an offensive coordinator. The reason why Smart right now sort of appears to be a little bit more like Saban is because he's winning the kind of recruiting battles that Saban has won. Georgia was number 3 in the country for the 2017 recruiting cycle, according to 24/7 Sports Composite. They're ranked number 1 right now for the 2018 class, and that's where the opportunity to copy Nick Saban comes from with Kirby Smart. He can do some of the same stuff in recruiting that Saban's been able to do. Now, Saban's been doing it longer, and that still gives Alabama a slight talent advantage in this game on Monday. But Smart is doing more, comparatively speaking, in recruiting against Saban, I think, than any former Saban assistant's done, and certainly in the SEC in quite some time.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, listen, when you talk about future dynasty and trying to predict this is not like the only time that Georgia's going to make a playoff appearance. I mean, this team is primed. They're taking the recruiting to a next level. When you look at Nick Saban and Kirby Smart here in Tuscaloosa, one of the things that both of them struggled with is mobile quarterbacks, dual threat, up-tempo type style quarterbacks, very similar to what Jalen Hurts here is in Tuscaloosa. Do you feel like that is still a weakness for Kirby Smart and Mel Tucker there?
So I'm going to answer your question a slightly different way. I think that Georgia's biggest weakness on Monday, and I'm curious to see how much Alabama tries to exploit this, I think Georgia's got a really good front seven. And as good as Hurts is as a mobile quarterback, and obviously he's so dynamic with his legs, there's no denying that, I think that Georgia fans feel very confident that the Buckus Award-winning linebacker Roquan Smith can do about as good a job spying a mobile quarterback as you could ever ask for. Now, Hurts may still make plays, but you can't have better personnel to try to stop a running quarterback than Roquan Smith. Where I see a weakness for Georgia, though, and where I see an opportunity for Alabama to try to exploit it is the Alabama wide receivers, I believe, are just much more talented than the Georgia defensive backs. The only position group for Georgia right now that I don't feel like is kind of rounding into national championship type form, the only group that sort of doesn't look like it belongs in this game is the Georgia defensive backs. You got to realize this is a Tulsa transfer starting. You've got a former walk-on starting. You've got former three-star prospects. That's not what you typically expect to see from an Alabama team in a game like this. Georgia, who's trying to be like Alabama, that's not what you typically see there. Now, for Bama, the wide receivers are Ruggs and Devontae Smith and Calvin Ridley and Jerry Jeudy and all these sort of former 4- and 5-star prospects. That's where Alabama, if they want to line up and throw deep, I know that Hurts misfired on the flea flicker in the Sugar Bowl, but if I was thinking about an area in which I thought Alabama might be able to exploit Georgia, I would say it's the wide receiving core against the Georgia defensive backs. And I think Georgia's strategy on Monday has got to try to find ways to mitigate that potential advantage for Alabama.
Well, it's kind of a weakness against a weakness, I guess you could say, because Bama's not very good at passing the football, and so maybe that's not something that Georgia really has to worry about.
Well, you're right about that in the regards of Jalen Hurts, and I'll admit this. I don't mean to in any way, make your audience mad. I'm not a fan of Jalen Hurts as a passer. I think that if Tua Tagovailoa was playing in this game, I think Alabama would have a lot, more sound offense. I think when you look at 2018, I think considering giving some more playing time to Tua is something that Alabama, ought to be looking into. But in terms of receivers getting open, I think the opportunity exists against the Georgia secondary, and then it becomes a matter of can Jalen Hurts deliver that football. But I have seen what some of your audience has seen in terms of, Hurts just not being incredibly sound when it comes to that. You respect him as an athlete. I'm not sure I trust him as a quarterback as of yet, but the Alabama wide receivers, I believe, are going to be open on.
Brandon, let me flip around. We've had some scouts that have come on this week and talked about, and I know you mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, but when you look at that matchup, Georgia's offensive line with Bama's defensive line, who do you see winning that battle?
That's a tough question because, the Georgia offensive line has played very well this season with all games except one. The game at Auburn, which is obviously a bad day for the team in general, was also a bad day for the Georgia offensive line. Georgia played much better in the rematch, so you start to ask the question of, is this a Georgia team that can be had up front there? Is this a Georgia team that is against another elite opponent? And how many truly elite defensive lines has Georgia had to face this season? Is this one of those moments when it's going to have a hard time holding up against Alabama? I think that Georgia probably feels that it cannot just simply line up straight ahead and just try to, bully an opponent against Alabama the way that it might against some other teams, including Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl last week. I think that Georgia's got enough respect for Alabama defensively that it's going to try to run the football, and Kirby Smart's going to stick with it even if it's not working in the first half. But I think Georgia also probably learned in that first Auburn game in November that, you've got to have some other things to add into the discussion as well. I suggested on my show today of, hey, maybe this is one of those games where you get Fromm more involved, and maybe you kind of sprinkle in some spread concepts with him to see if you can get Alabama on the move defensively and maybe see if you can, wear down and tire them out the way that Clemson would have in years past with Deshaun Watson, and maybe Oklahoma would have tried to do. Maybe Georgia tries to sprinkle some of that kind of stuff in here just because, it can be a tough matchup against Alabama if you're just putting your head down and trying to, bump up against them all night long, because obviously that's the kind of game that Alabama's very comfortable playing.
Brendan, what do you think the crowd will be making up when we talk about Georgia? They're certainly snatching up these tickets, these ticket prices. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, $2,400 for nosebleeds, $1,700 for nosebleeds. I mean, you go to StubHub, but it's crazy when you talk about ticket prices. It seems like Georgia fans are really driving this market up.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on that. I think you're right. I think that there is an insatiable appetite for Georgia when it comes to this team and this season, because Georgia has not been in this spot. And really quite some time. And so there was a huge, contingent of Dog fans traveled out to Pasadena. And, I certainly haven't heard too many people from a Georgia standpoint who've been scared off because of the outlandish prices yet. I think that Georgia fans are viewing this as maybe it becomes an every year type of thing in the future. But for now, this is not the kind of thing that Georgia fans have experienced before, so they want to be there. And yet, if you'll permit me to offer a little consumer advice here, I think for both Georgia fans and Alabama fans, be careful paying too much too soon for these tickets, because I think things have a way of kind of settling down as we kind of get closer to game time. We're still a few days away here, and right now you may have some people holding on to tickets because they've heard they're going to have a way of making just thousands and thousands of dollars for them. Therefore, they don't want to settle for anything less. But sometimes cooler heads kind of prevail here when you go a couple more days without selling your tickets. All of a sudden, maybe you have to come up with a price that does meet demand a little bit better. And so if you have Alabama fans who are listening right now, I'm sure you have many who are thinking about coming to the game if they can find reasonable tickets. It would not surprise me if you mentioned $2,400 a moment ago. It would not surprise me if by the time we get to Monday, they're not a little bit cheaper than that, because, my gosh, how many people are just walking around with $5,000 cash to sort of throw down on a pair of tickets? That's a lot of money, Ryan, as you know.
Oh, no doubt. But I did watch him down in New Orleans fall at about $125 for decent tickets. So,
and I don't think it goes down that low for this game.
Sure.
But could you get below four digits by the time the game gets ready to kick off? I think that you might, because, I actually think, we in the media have a tendency to sort of hype everything. And I almost wonder if these ticket prices haven't been hyped up to the point now where it's actually been exaggerated beyond the point of what reality truly is.
DawgNation Daily, the UGA podcast, DawgNation.com, SEC Country Live daily on the main page of SEC Country's Facebook account with Mike Johnson. Brandon, give me a lean or a score prediction. You can save yours predictions for Monday, but sort of give me a lean in this game.
Okay, so that's a great question, because I'm probably not ready to give my final score prediction yet, but I will say that if you're going to give a point spread of 4 points, at that point in time, I like Georgia to stay underneath that number. I think there's a big difference in Alabama as a 3-point favorite or a 4-point favorite. I guess I've even seen in some places as much as a 5-point favorite. I think Georgia's good enough certainly to keep this, field goal game or less, and it's just a matter of, can it make the extra plays that it has to make to actually win that game. But I'm certainly leaning this in the direction of this game being a little closer than the Vegas experts are saying right now, which to your audience is probably not a huge surprise to hear from a guy that does a Georgia show every day. I don't guess.